Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the tragedy that unfolded in Alexa's home was not just a single moment of violence, but the spark that ignited a slow-burning inferno, one that would consume not only Ava and Christina, but the entire Lansing Davis family. Rick's collapse was brutal and final, the crack of Ava's strike echoing in Christina's ears long after his body hit the ground. The pool of blood spreading across the hardwood was more than evidence of a crimite, was the visual symbol of the family's unraveling. Christina's legs weakened beneath her as she stared at the man who had always stood as both a judge and a thorn in her side, now reduced to silence by Ava's wrath. Her hands shook, her breath came in shallow bursts, and her heart screamed for her to run. But Ava's calculating presence was immediate, sharp, and suffocating. She wielded the truth of Christina's own sins like a dagger, reminding her of the night she tampered with the brakes, and twisting that secret into a weapon that ensured her silence. At that crossroads, Christina's mind fractured under the weight of impossible choices. Her father's blood on the floor begged for justice, yet her own survival demanded complicity. Ava, standing above Rick's body with cold detachment, left no room for negotiation. Christina's trembling hands joined in the cover-up, each motion slow and reluctant. She wiped blood from the walls, straightened the furniture, and rearranged objects so that no trace of Ava's violence would remain. But the smell of iron in the air clung to her skin, refusing to wash away. With every stroke of the rag, with every forced breath, Christina sealed herself into Ava's world of shadows. Molly's absence that night spared her the trauma of witnessing Rick's death, but it also placed her in the position of the relentless seeker. She knew her father's moods, his habits, and his resilience. Something about his sudden disappearance, something about the vague explanations that trickled down afterward, gnawed at her soul. She became restless, combing through inconsistencies, asking questions that Christina could barely answer. Christina's words faltered, her excuses thin and fragile, and Molly's suspicions grew like cracks in glass, each one spreading until the entire surface threatened to shatter. The once strong bond between sisters began to wither, not from arguments or distance, but from the silence that weighed heavier than any spoken betrayal. For Ava, the murder of Rick was not an ending but a beginning. It awakened a darker impulse, a hunger that thrived on control and silence. Her victory in binding Christina to her secret emboldened her, giving her the confidence to eliminate any threat that stood in her path. Cody became the next target, not because he posed immediate danger, but because Ava's paranoia could not tolerate loose ends. He had played his part, taken Christina's money, and inserted himself into conflicts he barely understood. In Ava's mind, his continued existence was a liability. The act of killing him was swift and unflinching, carried out not with rage but with icy calculation. When Cody fell, the last thread of hope Christina had for redemption seemed to unravel. By then, she understood that the moment she chose to help Ava with Rick's body, she had set herself on a course where every road led deeper into ruin. The nightmares began immediately. Christina could not close her eyes without seeing Rick's final expression, that look of fury cut short by disbelief, and the weight of knowing she had chosen silence instead of truth. Cody's death replayed in flashes, the sound of his body striking the ground ringing in her ears during the quietest hours of night. These visions left her exhausted, hollow-eyed, and withdrawn. She avoided Molly's gaze, avoided Alexa's concern, because she feared that both of them would see right through her into the abyss she carried inside. Her guilt became a parasite, consuming her ability to trust, to speak, to love. Every step she took in Port Charles felt as though eyes were following her, whispering accusations she could not silence. Molly's persistence only sharpened the knife, driven by love for her father and the unshakable certainty that something terrible had been hidden from her. She pursued the truth with quiet determination. She read reports, revisited the scene, questioned people who had last seen Rick alive. Each answer she uncovered seemed to clash with Christina's vague explanations, and her doubts transformed into conviction. She knew her sister was hiding something, though the magnitude of it was beyond her comprehension. The idea that Christina had been complicit in their father's death was too horrifying to accept, but the signs pointed relentlessly in that direction. Meanwhile, Alexis felt the tremors of the storm brewing between her daughters, but was blinded by her own guilt. She blamed herself for Rick's demise, for allowing her home to become the place where blood was spilled, for failing to see the warning signs that Ava's manipulations had spiraled into something darker. Alexis tried to hold her daughters together, tried to soothe Molly's anger and Christina's silence, but her attempts only highlighted the growing fracture. The truth was a beast clawing to get out. and Alexa's maternal instincts could not shield her children from its teeth. Ava thrived in the shadows of their turmoil. She moved with confidence, her steps precise, her voice calm. But her mind was sharpened by paranoia. Each person who came too close to the truth became a potential target. She relished the power of having Christina tethered to her by fear, using subtle reminders of the secret to keep her obedient. Yet the more Ava killed, the more unstable her world became. She believed she could control every variable, but the chaos she unleashed was bigger than her reach. Her crimes created ripples that touched too many lives, and those ripples were converging into a wave that even she could not stop. Christina's mistake became the center of her identity. It was no longer just a choice she regretted, it was the foundation of her existence. She could not undo the moment she helped Ava, could not reclaim her innocence. And with each new act of violence Ava committed, Christina became more deeply bound. Her silence no longer protected her, it poisoned her. She carried it like a weight on her chest, a pressure that threatened to suffocate her with every breath. She had wanted to avoid prison, to keep her secret hidden, but now she lived in a prison of Ava's making, a cell without walls that trapped her mind in endless torment. Molly, guided by both instinct and unshakable resilience, could not allow the mystery surrounding her father's death to fade into silence. The grief of losing Rick might have paralyzed another person, but for Molly it ignited a relentless pursuit of truth. She began observing Christina more closely, noticing subtle changes that only a sister could detect, the long silences that stretched too heavily, the restless glances that darted away whenever Rick's name was mentioned, and the way fear seemed etched into Christina's very posture. Each hesitation, each uneasy breath, only sharpened Molly's conviction that her sister was carrying a burden far darker than she could admit. What Molly did not yet realize, however, was that her relentless quest would eventually bring her face to face with a revelation far more harrowing than the death itself, the fact that Ava was not the only one with blood on her hands. Christina, her own flesh and blood, had been drawn into complicity, ensnared by fear and secrecy until she became an unwilling accomplice to their father's murder. Ava, meanwhile, grew into something more sinister than anyone had ever imagined. She was no longer simply a schemer operating in the shadows of Port Charles. She became its haunting presence, a figure whose influence infected every corner of the community. Ava wielded Christina like a weapon, using her knowledge of the brake line incident as both shield and sword, binding the young woman into submission. With Rick gone and Cody silenced, Ava's power escalated, her actions serving as chilling warnings that anyone who dared oppose her would face the same fate. She created a climate of terror where trust eroded and whispers filled the air, where even the strongest alliances in the Corinthostivus family trembled under the weight of uncertainty. What had started as a desperate act of self-preservation hardened into a pattern of ruthless control, and Ava thrived on the chaos she manufactured. For Christina, each passing day tightened the chains around her soul. Protecting Ava did not free her, it condemned her. The trust she once shared with Molly fractured under the strain of lies, while Alexis, unaware of the true depth of the secret, felt her daughter slipping further into shadows she could not penetrate. Christina's silence became her prison. With every lie told, every piece of evidence concealed, she laid down another stone in the path that led her to ruin. Her spirit eroded, leaving behind a hollow shell tormented by guilt, haunted by her father's final moments and Cody's silenced voice. The consequences of her choice grew beyond her control. Port Charles itself seemed to recoil beneath Ava's looming shadow, as if the entire community was being pulled into a storm no one could escape. Friends grew suspicious, enemies grew emboldened, and a constant sense of dread seeped into every corner of the town. What had once been a tragedy confined to one family threatened to unravel the fragile balance of Port Charles altogether. Yet the greatest tragedy lay not in the loss of Rick or Cody, but in the erosion of Christina's very identity. She had not only lost Molly's trust and Alexis' faith, but also her own sense of who she was. The question was no longer simply about guilt or innocence, about who swung the fatal blow, but whether Christina herself could withstand the consuming shadow of Ava. Could she escape the grip of the woman who had destroyed so many lives, or would she sink fully into the abyss, becoming a reflection of the darkness she had chosen to shield? And so, as whispers of the truth began to circle closer, the tension in Port Charles grew unbearable. Secrets, once buried, never stayed hidden forever, and Molly's determination to uncover them ensured that the day of reckoning would come. When it did, the most agonizing question would not be who killed Rick or Cody, for that truth would already be known, but whether Christina could ever break free from Ava's hold before the weight of her silence consumed her entirely. If the truth of Ava's actions were finally dragged into the light, Port Charles would not merely be shaken, it would fracture into pieces, each one sharp enough to cut through the bonds of family, loyalty, and love that had been painstakingly built over decades. The deaths of Rick and Cody would no longer be isolated tragedies, they would be catalysts, igniting a firestorm of suspicion, grief, and betrayal that would engulf the entire community. For Molly, the revelation would carve wounds that no time could heal. She had already endured the unbearable pain of losing her father, but loss alone would pale beside the searing knowledge that Christina, the sister she had trusted, had chosen silence over justice. It would feel like a second death, one more intimate and cruel than the first. Every memory of childhood laughter, every moment of solidarity between sisters, would suddenly feel tainted, poisoned by the realization that Christina had betrayed the very foundation of their bond. That betrayal would ignite a rage inside Molly that could not be quenched by forgiveness. Her grief would transform into an iron determination. The truth must come out, no matter how destructive, no matter how many bridges burned in the process. If exposing Ava meant destroying Christina's future, so be it. In Molly's eyes, justice for Rick was worth any sacrifice. Alexis would find herself caught in the cruelest position a mother could imagine. One daughter demanded vengeance, while the other withered under the crushing weight of her own guilt. Alexis, both lawyer and mother, would feel the pull of two worlds tearing her apart. Her instincts as a lawyer told her to side with Molly, justice, accountability, truth, but her heart as a mother clung to Christina, who was unraveling before her eyes, a woman collapsing under the unbearable burden of secrets. Alexis would feel as though no matter what choice she made, she would lose one of her children. Her guilt would deepen with every passing day. She would replay the chain of events, wondering how she had allowed her family's conflicts with Rick and Ava to spiral into bloodshed. She would punish herself for not stepping in earlier, for failing to protect Rick, and for failing to shield her daughters from Ava's manipulations. The tragedy would force Alexis to realize that she was powerless to save everyone, and perhaps powerless to save anyone at all. The fallout from Cody's death would ripple outward in widening circles, touching every corner of Port Charles. Dante would be shaken to his core, tormented by the loss of a friend and racked with guilt that he hadn't seen the danger coming. Sasha would be haunted, unable to accept that Cody's chaotic but good-hearted presence had been extinguished so violently. Brooklyn, already struggling to find stability in her own life, would be devastated by the absence of someone she had cared for, her grief mingling with anger as suspicions of Ava grew, and the community at large, from Metro Court regulars to Quartermain allies, would feel the tremors. Cody had been part of so many circles that his absence would leave a void too noticeable to ignore. His death would not be dismissed as a random tragedy, it would demand explanation. As whispers spread, Christina's silence would become impossible to defend. Too many pieces would fit together: her presence at Rick's death, her financial involvement with Cody, and her increasingly erratic behavior. To those who knew her best, the guilt in her eyes would become undeniable. The narrative would begin to shift from Ava as a lone murderer to Ava and Christina as co-conspirators wielding violence, the other ensuring silence. It would be a scandal unlike any Port Charles had seen in years, tearing through the Corinthostivist name and reshaping how the town viewed them. For Christina, the unmasking would be the final breaking point. The secrets she had carried, the lies she had told, the choices she had made, deal of it would collapse upon her in a tidal wave of shame. She would find herself estranged from Molly, who could no longer look at her without seeing betrayal. She would feel the distance from Alexis, who, even if she tried to protect her, could never erase the knowledge that her daughter had allowed Rick's killer to walk free. Christina's own identity would begin to disintegrate. Once defiant, passionate, and reckless, she would become hollow, consumed by self-loathing. She would wonder whether there was any way back, or if she had already crossed the threshold into a darkness from which she could never return. Ava, of course, would not go quietly. The exposure of her crimes would only sharpen her survival instincts. She would lash out with more desperation, weaving lies, planting false leads, and perhaps even threatening more lives to protect herself. Yet, for all her cunning, Ava's isolation would deepen. Each crime she committed, each betrayal she engineered, stripped her of allies until only fear surrounded her. And fear is not a shield that lasts forever. Sooner or later, she would falter, and when she did, the full force of Port Charles' wrath would descend upon her. The question that would loom above all others was not simply who killed Rick, or Kaditho's answers would be undeniable. The true question would be whether Christina could withstand the storm Ava had unleashed. Could she break free from the shadows before they consumed her entirely? Could she reclaim even a fragment of her soul? Or was she already too entangled in Ava's darkness to ever escape? For Port Charles, the answers would come at a steep price. Families would shatter, friendships would dissolve, and the fragile trust that bound the community together would be ripped apart. The exposure of Ava's crimes would not mark the end of a tragedy, but the beginning of a reckoning. Molly's pursuit of truth would become unstoppable. Alexa's struggle between daughters would tear her in half. Christina's guilt would crush her, and Ava's empire of lies would crumble. And when the dust settled, Port Charles itself would never be the same, scarred by the knowledge that silence can be as deadly as the hand that strikes the fatal blow. Ava's descent into darkness would not happen all at once, but through a series of increasingly desperate decisions that revealed just how deeply she had trapped herself. At first, her attempts to control the narrative might seem almost convincing. She could fabricate alibis, plant false evidence, and manipulate others into pointing suspicion elsewhere. Ava had always been a master of persuasion, skilled in turning vulnerability into leverage, and she would use those abilities ruthlessly. She might even succeed in convincing some that Rick's death was accidental, or that Cody's disappearance was unrelated. Yet the cracks in her story would grow larger with every attempt to stretch the truth. Lies, when told to cover blood, inevitably bleed themselves. Ava's arrogance would blind her to the reality that Port Charles had seen many liars and manipulators before, and in the end, no one had ever been able to outrun the truth forever. The more Ava scrambled to keep control, the more isolated she would become. Each deception demanded loyalty from those around her, but loyalty is fragile when it is built on fear. Friends who once tolerated her schemes would begin to pull away, unwilling to risk their own reputations or safety. Business allies would withdraw, wary of becoming collateral damage. Even family, bound by blood, would hesitate to stand beside her. What remained would be Ava alone in a crumbling fortress of lies. Surrounded by walls she had built herself, she would lash out in anger, turning her suspicion on anyone who dared question her. Every glare, every veiled threat, would further expose the hollowness of her power. By trying to silence others, Ava would inadvertently highlight her own guilt. For Christina, the unmasking of the truth would be a punishment far more devastating than handcuffs or prison bars. Her betrayal would not just be publicity, it would be intimate, cutting into the very core of her identity. She had chosen to protect Ava over her father, over her sister, over her family. That choice, made in fear and desperation, would follow her forever. When the truth came to light, Christina would not only be judged by the town, but condemned by the very people she had sought to protect. Molly's eyes, once filled with sisterly affection, would now burn with a cold fury that words could not soften. Alexis, though her love would never disappear, would find it impossible to look at her daughter without seeing the consequences of silence. Even extended family, even friends, would view Christina differently as someone who had allowed darkness to thrive. The psychological torment would grind Christina down. Nights would be plagued with images of Rick's fall, the sound of the object cracking against his skull, the sight of Cody's lifeless body. These memories would loop endlessly in her mind, robbing her of rest and sanity. She would begin to unravel, unable to hold herself together under the crushing weight of guilt. Once fiery and passionate, Christina would become hesitant, withdrawn, a shadow of her former self. She would question whether she had destroyed her chance at happiness the very moment she chose to shield Ava. In protecting a killer, had she sentenced herself to a lifetime of being seen as nothing more than an accomplice to evil? Port Charles itself would not escape the fallout. The town, already accustomed to scandal and betrayal, would be consumed by a new wave of paranoia. Every whispered conversation in the metro court, every glance exchanged in the hospital hallways, would return to the same subject, Ava and her crimes. People would begin to wonder what other secrets remained buried, whose lives had been manipulated, and whether anyone else had been sacrificed to Ava's hunger for control. Families would fracture under the strain of suspicion, and friendships would be tested by the question of who knew what and when. The Corinthostivus family, at the heart of this storm, would find itself irreparably damaged. Trust, once fragile but present, would shatter completely. Molly's relentless pursuit of truth would drive a wedge not only between her and Christina, but also between her and Alexis, who would be torn between daughters. The once complex but enduring bond among them would dissolve into mistrust, bitterness, and grief. The family name, once a mixture of pride and notoriety, would now be weighed down by scandal. The wider community would feel no safer. Ava's ability to commit murder and walk free for so long would terrify the people of Port Charles. If she could kill Rick and Cody, who else had been in her sights? Who else might already be gone? Their deaths disguised as accidents or misfortunes. The fear would not be limited to Ava's immediate circle. It would spread like poison, leaving residents anxious and uncertain. But ultimately, Ava's undoing would come not from external forces, but from within. The mistakes she made in her desperation to hold onto power would betray her. Perhaps she would leave behind a trace of evidence. Or perhaps her lies would contradict one another until even the most loyal could no longer deny the truth. Once exposed, Ava would face the collective wrath of a community that had lost too much to her manipulations. Her reign of fear would crumble, leaving her alone, despised and vulnerable. And Christina, standing amidst the wreckage, would be left to grapple with the question that had haunted her since the beginning. Had she lost her chance at redemption the moment she decided to protect Ava? Was there any path back from the abyss she had fallen into? Or had she been swallowed by it completely? For Port Charles, the tragedy would not just be the deaths of Rick and Cody, but the permanent scars left on a family, a community, and a young woman who had traded her soul for silence.